In this lesson, we'll take a look at some advanced viewport display options that can be found in Cinema 4D. Okay, so let's just start with a blank scene once again, and let's drop in just a couple of little placeholder objects. So maybe a cube, let's drop in maybe just a torus, and back here, maybe just a simple sphere. Okay, just a couple of objects to help populate my scene. Now, over here in the display options and over here in the options, we have a number of different settings here that we've already had a chance to take a look at. So this is where we can start to control things like the shading. Over here in the options, this is where we can start to control maybe what things are going to be seen in the viewport, as far as whether or not we want to see transparency, if we want to see shadows, if we want to see any tags or textures. But there's actually some even more advanced settings that are sort of hidden inside of Cinema 4D. Now these can be found if we go up to the Options menu, and down toward the bottom we can choose Configure. Now there's actually two options here. One of these is Configure and the other is Configure All. Now if we just use Configure, that means that the changes that we're about to make will only affect the current viewport. If we choose Configure All, then that means the changes that we're going to make over here will affect all viewports. So over here in our new configuration settings over here, a lot of these will look fairly familiar. So the shading, the wireframe, a lot of these options that are checked on, again, a lot of these will look familiar. These are a lot of the same settings that we have up here and as well as in the options. Now, the real benefit to this is that we can start to get a little bit more advanced. So in something like the active objects, for example, we have our default shading, and just like what we could do in our top menu up here, we could switch this to something like quick shading, which you can see as I set it over here, it reflects in both places. If we wanted to set this to maybe just a quick hidden line, again, pretty standard stuff here. But what makes this sort of nice is we could actually, from this viewport, we could start to set completely different settings for maybe inactive objects. So for inactive objects, let's turn on separate settings. And let's say for Cinema 4D, any active or selected objects, we want to have our default shading. But maybe any unselected objects or inactive objects, maybe we just set it to a simple line. And now you can see only the selected object has our default shading. As soon as I select another object, you can see how that shading now changes. So this could be sort of useful for a number of situations. Let's go back and into our configuration. One of the things I will do is go ahead and lock this attribute manager so that way this doesn't keep disappearing on me. So we do have this setting, really useful as far as determining which objects will receive what sort of graphical treatment. If we go into the filters, this is pretty much the same sets of options that we can find up here in this filters menu. If we go into view, this is where we can start to really control exactly what we see in our viewport. So right now, if we turn on something like save frames or render frames, you can see both of these are turned on by default. This is controlling sort of this little tinted area that you may notice on either side of your viewport. What this is doing is determining or letting you see which parts of our viewport are the actual renderable areas. So whenever we set off a final render, which we'll talk about in one of the later lessons in this course, the area that we see inside of this little shaded area is the part of our scene that will be rendered. Anything that falls into these shaded areas will not be included as part of our render. Sort of a way of just framing up your scenes and letting you sort of see that. Now we have the option here to turn that off, although I would recommend leaving that on, because otherwise if you start to have objects that maybe start to pass over here, whenever you start to set off your final renders, you'll really start to run the risk of objects being cut off. So I would always recommend leaving these turned on. But what we could do is, let's say for the opacity, if we wanted to make these a little bit easier for us to see, maybe we find those a little bit difficult, we could start to crank up the opacity. Now make those visually a little bit more apparent. We can also come in here and completely change the color of that. So if we wanted something that maybe stands out a little bit more, and just come in here, and there we go. We can also come in here and start to control a lot of things like the axis scale. So this is going to control the size of our gizmos here. So you can see as I start to dial that up or down, you can make those a little bit easier for you to grab if you have difficulty grabbing those. We can also start to change things like the actual editor axis. So right now this is set to the bottom left, which we can see here. If we maybe wanted that up in a different position, we could choose maybe the upper right, and there we go. It'll place that up here. We can choose how large that display is going to be. So lots and lots of control that we have here. One of the things that may be of particular interest to you is if we go back to the display tab, if we go into this area here, one of the things that has been updated in Cinema 4D R14 is this ability to sort of interactively hover over an object, and you start to get these outlines over any object that you may potentially select. So it sort of is a nice little preview so you can see exactly what it is that is going to be selected before you necessarily make the selection. Now, if you find that visually a little bit jarring, or if you would rather have that feature turned off, you do have that control from this area. So in the display tab, that's going to be this outlines. So if I turn that off, now you can see that little highlight no longer happens. And this is essentially going to take us back to the way that earlier versions of Cinema 4D used to work. Okay, so that is a quick look at how we can start to come in here and have a little bit more advanced control over exactly what things are going to be displayed in the viewport and exactly how they're going to be displayed. So that will now pretty much bring us to the end of this introductory section of our course. So now, starting in the next lesson, Justin is going to take over and start to introduce you to some of the modeling tools found in Cinema 4D.